What's up, my name is Technoba here for Troubleshoot and welcome back to another video. In this quick guide, I'll be taking you through optimizing Spider-Man Miles Morales now that it's out on Steam. It is a 2-year-old game, however it is the first debut on Steam, and so there'll be a couple of issues and things that need to be ironed out. Anyways, let's get into it. This video is not going to cover Windows optimizations, other than a few simple tips. In the description down below, you'll find a Windows 10, 11, and NVIDIA optimization guide to get the most out of your PC. At this point, you should have already updated Windows, your graphics driver, closed pretty much everything not relating to the game itself, and disabled any unnecessary overlays, like the Discord overlay if you're not currently using it. Without further ado, let's get into the actual game itself to see what we can do there. In the main launcher menu here, the first time you fire up the game, you can disable it by clicking this box over here. We can access some settings, which is great, especially if something happens to break before we get in game. These settings you'll also have in game for the most part, so I'll be running through it there instead. Just know that if you're not able to see the game or you mess up any settings, you can come back to the launcher here. I'd only recommend disabling the show launcher tick box here when you're happy with how the game looks and how it performs. So the game's pretty much playing as soon as you get into it. However, if you'd like to customize, find a good part to pause, hit escape, and click settings over here. Then we'll be looking for display and graphics, and inside of here, we can start customizing how the game looks pretty much immediately. In the display section, we'll start at the very top with display mode. From the window mode, you should select full screen or exclusive full screen for a little bit of extra performance. Preferably exclusive full screen. Display resolution should match your display or at least be compatible, that way things won't be blurry. Aspect ratio is your preference, and the refresh rate should match your monitor. VSync should be disabled unless you're getting screen tearing, where the top half and the bottom half of your screen don't match, so turn this off. Then NVIDIA Reflex Low Latency, you should only turn this on if you're getting a CPU or GPU bottleneck. You have on and on plus boosters options, so you can either leave this off or set it just to on. Your mileage will vary with this, and you won't really be able to tell the difference as it's not a Twitch shooter, but if you do feel a difference, feel free to play around with it. Calibration is your preference. Brightness and HDR settings, as well as the contrast, are all up to you and how you like the game to look. They'll have almost no impact on FPS, or at least if they do, it's probably worth the impact as it changes how the game looks the most drastically. Then at the very bottom, upscaling, I'd absolutely recommend you have DLSS frame generation on if you have an RTX 40 or above series graphics card. Upscaling method, you should have DLSS selected if you have an NVIDIA graphics card from the 20 series or above. You also have IGTI, which is Insomniac Games' temporal injection, which I assume is their own sort of upscaling, which you could choose to use or could not choose to use, but preferably you should be selecting AMD FSR if you can't choose DLSS. That way you can set a sharpness level, 5 is 50%. On DLSS, I have sharpness around 7 or 70%, and on AMD FSR, I'll have it around 50 or 40%. Essentially, DLSS and AMD FSR render the game at a lower resolution and blow it up using AI magic. Now they've made things really simple for upscaling users. I like this. Dynamic resolution scaling. Whatever you set here, which goes from about 40 or 30 all the way up to your refresh rate of your monitor up here, your PC will automatically upscale the game and adjust it while you're playing it to try and keep this target frame rate. So if you're getting 40 and you set this to 60, for example, it'll lower the resolution slightly and use magic to blow it up to try and keep you around 60 FPS. The more FPS you try and squeeze out of your PC, the further away you are from your actual FPS at normal default settings, the more visual artifacts you'll start to see. However, if you don't like this and you prefer the normal presets, you can push it all the way to the right or left to off, and upscale quality will be unlocked. From here we can choose all of the normal presets. Usually you'll have this at quality or balanced. You'd want to choose upscale quality if you don't want random hitching, as the game adjusts its resolution in parts where things get really intense. Dynamic resolution scaling is good enough, and you'd probably leave it at least 60 or maybe even higher. If you have upscaling set to off, you get anti-aliasing at the very bottom, which I usually wouldn't recommend, and there's a few different options here. But for me, I'd say just to use DLSS or AMD FSR. Now we can apply our changes using E, and we can scroll up to the top. Already you should see some differences in the background and probably even see a different FPS count if you have it enabled. If you have it on Steam, hit Shift Tab, head across to Settings, then In-Game, and we'll enable the FPS counter by clicking the drop down here and choosing, say, top left. I like to have high contrast color set to on. Okay, and now we can see our FPS on the top left. 94 FPS is what I'm getting. If I turn off DLSS, apply, I'm now getting around 70 FPS, and whoa, there's some really strange things going on here. I actually have no idea what's causing this. Oh, alright, it has to do with anti-aliasing. SMAA does nothing, but TAA fixes it for the most part. Very weird. Dynamic resolution scaling? No. Okay. Well, ignoring this weird visual glitch, I would say if you choose to have anti-aliasing on, use DLAA. TAA still has a weird shimmery effect, and SMAA is pretty much as good as having nothing. Very weird. But for me, I'll be using DLSS for some free extra performance. Let's move on to the graphics tab at the very top. From here we can choose from the normal presets of high, medium, low, very low, and of course, very high. You should probably already know what ballpark to aim for here based on your current hardware. If you have something terrible, set it to very low and move up from there. Otherwise, you have something very good, set it to very high and we'll move down from there if necessary. You can already see my FPS is around 70 to get the most fair comparison out of this because the game is being live rendered in the background. I'd absolutely recommend going back to display and turning off the dynamic resolution scaling here. That way we can more fairly see the difference between our changes. So around 95 to 98 FPS on very high on a 3080 Ti, and on very low, around 120, 130 FPS. So there is a lot to be gained here, at least because things are changing live in the background, of course. As you change these settings, you'll begin to learn the effect that they have. So, texture quality, this should have absolutely no effect on your FPS, and that's very true. On low, I get 100. On very high, I get around 98-ish, and that's because this completely depends on the amount of VRAM in your graphics card. If you have anywhere between 6 and 8 or even more gigabytes, you can set this to very high and forget about it. Otherwise, set it to medium, and on lower end graphics cards, set it to low and move on. For me, I'll leave this on very high as I have tons of VRAM. Texture filtering, this will have pretty much no effect on your FPS, 99, 98, pushing it up to 16, pretty much the same, and down to trilinear, the lowest option here, as expected, almost no difference. This, however, does have a huge impact on textures in game. You can see immediately these sharp corners and things like that on the edge here between trilinear and 16x have a huge difference in how they fit in with the terrain. For me, I absolutely prefer having this set higher, such as 8 or 16, and that'll probably be the same for you. You'll only notice the difference here on very low-end graphics cards. Shadow quality, of course, has to do with shadows. Because this isn't a Twitch shooter, I'd absolutely recommend having these options set higher rather than lower. And of course, your FPS will really be based on how many objects are in your scene and how many are casting shadows. Usually in the middle of a city is the best place to test this out, as there's lots of objects casting shadows. If you're not sure, leave it on medium, and if you like how the game looks with better, crispier shadows, set it up to high or very high on high-end graphics cards. On low-end graphics cards, of course, you'll need to crank it down. Ambient occlusion should have pretty much no effect on FPS, and as expected, that's exactly true. This mainly has to do with corners of shadows and creates depth, and that's absolutely true, or at least in a very subtle way. You'd usually leave this on SSAO on lower end graphics cards or HBAO plus on higher end graphics cards. Screen space reflections have to do with reflections on glass and things like that, and they're pretty much free because of how they're made. They don't use ray tracing or anything, and it's been around practically forever, so it's pretty much free shadows for no performance cost. However, ray-traced reflections and shadows will have a huge impact on FPS in-game, and of course are only available on newer graphics cards. If I turn on reflections, you'll see the game freezes for quite a long time, and eventually when it comes back, if you're around a lot of glossy surfaces or shiny water, you'll see your FPS drops a lot. If you just have it on, even with few reflections, your FPS will still drop a lot. If you value FPS, you shouldn't use any ray tracing options. Some of these can look rather pretty. I'd find that reflections are far more noticeable than ray traced shadows, so keep that in mind. But of course, if you choose to enable these and especially push them up to their higher options, you'll be losing a ton of FPS for practically nothing. You can mitigate some of those effects by changing the resolution of reflections, geometry detail for shadows and reflections, and of course object range for how far ray tracing actually has an effect on your game. But for me, I'll just be having these off. If you'd want higher FPS or on higher end RTX and other ray tracing supported graphics cards, I'd have reflections on and shadows maybe on medium. Pretty much good enough. Then down here we have geometry. Level of detail has to do with the quality of models loaded into your game, and the higher you have this, the more VRAM your game will use, and of course has a relatively large performance impact. I'll turn off ray tracing, and moving from very high at around 95-ish FPS, I have pretty much no impact on FPS here. You'll only notice a difference in level of detail FPS when there's objects loaded in the distance. Higher end graphics cards push this up, lower end graphics cards push it down. Traffic density would have more effect on your CPU than anything, as well as crowd density over here as they need to walk around and path navigate in the city. If you find yourself lagging in populated areas, these are two options that you should push down. Higher end CPUs, you probably don't need to worry about this at all. Hair quality, usually this will have to do with your graphics card once again. However, it can be very noticeable, such as high to very low here. It looks pretty much like two completely different hairstyles, but that's just because of how hair physics works in-game. If you prefer one style over the other, hey, sure, that's for you. Otherwise, if you like a more realistic experience, you'll probably want to have this on high, as every other option has that different style of hair. Though, between medium and high, you'll notice the biggest FPS impact when hair's moving around. Then, weather particle quality, you'll probably not notice anything, unless of course it's raining and things like that. So, if you lose FPS in certain weather scenarios, you'll be turning this option down. Then down to the bottom, camera effects. These are more your preference than anything, and will have a very minimal impact on FPS. Depth of field I usually turn off just because I like seeing things clearly and I don't need to feel like I need glasses. You can see the effect here where we're focused on our character or whatever distance we're looking at and focusing on, and on off we can see everything clearly and even read the words in the background that are pretty much completely gone on higher depth of field options. It seems like pretty much everything other than off completely blurs out the background, and very low / off allows you to see what's going on. In my opinion, I'd have this set to very low so there's a slight depth of field effect, but definitely not something as much, making me feel like I need glasses. Bloom has to do with blurry light effects. As you can see here, it changes a huge amount on the screen as there's lots of lights in the scene. Lens flares has to do with those bright, long splashes of light that come out from spotlights on your screen. This is your preference. Chromatic aberration. For me personally, I like having this off. Otherwise, you can see a red-green split on the side of the screen here. And once I turn this off, you'll probably very easily notice the difference when I turn it back on. Personally, this isn't something that I like, and it seems very Unreal Engine-y. A lot of games abuse this in that they push it far too far, and personally, I'm not a huge fan of this effect when it's used in excess. Here, it's not too bad as it's on the extreme far sides of my screen, but it's your preference. For me, I'll have this off. Vignette, that has to do with darkening the corners and edges of your screen. Personally, I don't mind this effect. I'd probably leave it on. Motion blur strength. If you find yourself getting motion sick, turn this off. Otherwise, if you like things blurring while you look around, this is your preference. I'll usually keep it very low, if not off. Field of view. Once again, your preference. You can push it higher for a wider field of view or lower for a narrower field of view. Film grain strength. If you find yourself recording or streaming, having film grain pushed higher can put a higher load on your encoder and require more bandwidth or disk space to record the game itself, so pushing this lower is usually a good idea if you're recording it. Though, if you're not recording, you can keep this on as it adds a nice movie-like effect to it. Then finally, sharpness. That's your preference once more. If you have an ultra-wide screen, head back, head into Game, and inside of here, you can see HUD widescreen scale. I'd recommend changing this around if the HUD is far too far to the sides of your screen while you're playing the game and you don't like looking around to them. Then camera shake. Once again, if you find yourself getting motion sick, you'd probably want to turn this off. And with that really comes the end of this optimization guide. Once again, this is a story-focused game rather than a Twitch shooter game, so really set whatever looks good to you and performs relatively well on your PC. You probably don't need more than 30 FPS, and that's pretty much the console average. And in a scene like this, you saw the background was hugely shimmery and looks terrible. If I head back to the display and graphics option, for example, I really don't like how this looked. I'm pretty sure that has to do with the depth of field over here. Yep, disabling it, things look great. Pushing it up, things look great as well. Having it set to very low, things are shimmery. Right, so I take back what I said there. Off is probably what I'd use. Otherwise, I'd have it on probably medium or high. Low and very low have this terrible shimmery effect. Anyways, I'll set this to off in my case. But as you can see, I've just made an adjustment based on what I feel like, because hey, that's really all that matters. Here, for example, you could change the bloom effect. So bloom off versus on. That's exactly what you'll be doing for pretty much all different scenes based on what you like and what you don't like. Anyways, that's really about it for this quick optimization guide. Once again, you'll find Windows tips and NVIDIA tips in the description down below, as well as some related videos. Thank you all for watching. My name's been TechnoBehavior Troubleshoot, and I'll see you all next time. Ciao.